Morning all, welcome to episode 4 of the film blog of 2013. Speaking to you today from a very, very snowy and cold north coast of England. So snowy and cold, in fact, I couldn't actually get home yesterday. So, rather than the traditional Friday night spent on the train going down the west coast, I instead spent my evening at the Tyneside Cinema, which was pleasant. Went to go and see Django Unchained, the new film from Quentin Tarantino. I should say, straight from the off, I'm not a Tarantino fanboy. I know there are literally thousands, millions of people out there who are huge, huge fans. I have never really got why people hold Tarantino in such reverence. I would say from the start it may well be because the three films that are generally accepted as his masterpieces, Reservoir Dogs, Pulp Fiction, Jackie Brown, I have not seen any of them. Unfortunately, my experience with Tarantino has been restricted to Kill Bill, Inglourious, and Death List. And I think even the most die-hard Tarantino fan would say if you'd seen those four films as a selection of his work rather than the first three, you probably would not think in any great shakes as a director. Anyway, circumstances said that that was the only thing that was on. You know, I've always been a huge fan of Jamie Foxx, so I thought, well, let's go in there and let's see what it's like. The first thing to say is, the last big film we reviewed on here was Les Mis, which was basically busy getting plaudits through every single angle imaginable. It's not quite the same with Django. Even though both films are up for Best Picture Oscar, Django, it's dividing critics an awful lot more than Les Mis did. For example, you've got things like The Guardian gave it 5 stars, it got 4 stars from Time Out, and yet the likes of Sight and Sound have absolutely panned it. I would say straight from the off, I can't see it getting Best Picture, for the simple reason that you've got a film here in which there is not a single sympathetic white American character. The only even white character who's sympathetic is Christoph Waltz, who's obviously he's Austrian, so I don't see it really troubling the Academy for Best Picture. I can't see it. As I said before, I think Best Picture is going to go to Les Mis, and I think that's fair enough. So, from the start, I think, as I was saying during my review of Les Mis, it does seem that at the moment there is a theme going along for directors to start making really, really long films. I said that I felt that Les Mis ought to have been as long as it was. I could have had even more, whereas I've made my feelings on the length of The Hobbit very, very clear, the fact that I think it is overlong, overindulgent, baggy and lazy. This sort of falls in between. It is a long film. It's the best part of 3 hours. I think for the most part it does keep your interest. But there's a very, very clear point at which something happens. There's a huge firefight. And the scenes that follow that for the rest of the film, you're sort of thinking, well, why are they here? Because you could have done without an entire section in there, because it doesn't really add anything. So, but back to that later on. So first of all, Tarantino as a director, as I say, I've never really got this sort of worship at the temple of Tarantino, as it were. I mean, he does do pulpy violence very, very well. I mean, for example, Kill Bill, there are a lot of scenes in that which are very, very stylised and very beautiful to watch. With Django, I mean, it's been getting an awful lot of criticism from a lot of quarters to do with the amounts of violence in it. Now, I don't have a problem with violence in a film as long as it's there to enhance the narrative. I don't particularly enjoy violence for the sake of violence, but if it's necessary to the storyline, which I feel in Django it is, then I don't have an issue with it. The The strange thing with the violence is that it's in two very distinct categories. You've either got sort of the pulpy, stylised, spaghetti western kind of violence in which people's limbs are flying off and there's blood spurting everywhere. But there's a second undercurrent of violence, and that's the violence you see being dished out towards the African Americans, the slaves. And it seemed to jar a bit with me that the only violence being perpetrated towards the black characters was always very, very serious, very, very brutal. It was done so well, but you couldn't watch the screen because it was so violent, so torturous, so oppressive. And yet, the white characters who die, pretty much every time that happens, it's done with someone's head flying off or blood spurting out of somewhere. It's quite jarring to see a director treating those two distinct camps in such different ways. And why is the violence towards one set of people always in one way, and the violence towards another people is in a different way? The difference is, and perhaps this is the clever part, Samuel L. Jackson's character is the only black character who is treated, violence-wise, the same as the white characters, which will come on to him a bit later on, because he deserves a bit of space for himself. So, the violence, like I say, I've not got a problem with it, I just don't really understand why. Oh, I understand why he's done it, I don't think it works as well as I think he was hoping it would work, in that it divides into two camps. It sort of makes the implication here that all the characters in this film who are black are necessarily good, apart from Samuel L. Jackson, and all the characters in the film who are white aren't necessarily bad, with the exception of Christoph Waltz. It just seems a bit lazy to me to be doing that. I think we need more shades of grey. We don't need everything being either that person's good, that person's white. But, having said that, what Tarantino is doing, he is making a play on the Western genre, in which case what he's doing is actually quite clever. Because if you watch the old Westerns, you will see the good guys and the bad guys are divided by what colour hats they wear. So, the bad guy wear a black hat, whereas the good guys wear a slightly fairer hat. And if that's what he's doing, it's very, very clever. And I've no reason to believe that isn't what he's trying to do. So we'll give him the benefit of the doubt there, and so that's what he's trying to do. He's trying to make a pastiche of the genre, and he's substituted hat colours for skin colours, which, if that is what he's done, it's quite clever. So, what we have to look at, as well as the violence, in terms of what everyone is talking about, is the language and the frequent use of racial slurs against the black characters, done either from, to, with. Everyone is saying the same word. Now, there's been an awful lot of debate about whether or not this is glorifying the use of racial slurs. I don't think that it is. I think it's only fair if we say that what Tarantino here has done is built a period piece set in a certain time period. And in that time period, I think we all know that people were using that word. And I don't really see how I could make a period piece of that time without using it. It's like anyone that has read any of the new James Bond novels, the reason they all fail is because they can't get to the character of James Bond, who is this sexist misogynist, because he's of a time. And what you have to do, and what Sebastian Faulks did in the only one that really works, was to set the story back in that time and just accept that it's not the author who is misogynist, it's not the author who is sexist, it is the character, and it is the time in which they're playing it. In the same way, it's not fair to say that Quentin Tarantino is a racist who is glorifying this word, because he's not, as such. It's a word that was in frequent use around that time. how could he make a film of that time with those attitudes and not mention it? I don't see how you do that. So, personally, I haven't got a problem with the language. Others may do, but, you know, it's a period piece. You have to use period language. That's just how it works. So, no issue at all with the language. Now, in terms of what the film does well, without doubt, there are 4 performances in this film which are absolutely standout performances. Jamie Foxx as Django is brilliant. Christoph Waltz steals every scene he's in. He's superb. Every single scene he is in. Because he plays this character of a dentist, or rather an ex-dentist, now bounty hunter, who sort of drives around the Midwest looking to try and capture people with bounties on their heads, kill them, deliver the authorities, and take the reward. And this is how, when the film opens, he first meets Django, because he is looking for 3 brothers who owned a plantation on which Django was previously enslaved. Now, Christoph Waltz requires Django to help him point out who these brothers are. In return for this, he wants to give Django some money and his freedom if he'll do this, because that's basically the premise of the whole film, is that now Christoph Waltz is going to buy Django, take his help, and then free him. Now, unfortunately, Django's current owners are none too happy with the solution, and it does what Tarantino does so well, which is take a character to just sort of sigh, look away a bit, and suddenly shoot someone stone dead. And this is what Tarantino has always done quite well, is moving a scene from intense to violence in seconds. You never see it coming. You predict by the end, when the violence comes from the start, suddenly you've gone from one scene to the other in a split second, and there's suddenly people lying on the floor in pools of blood. So it's done really, really well. So, Christoph Waltz now has Django, he's freed him, and they're off to try and find these brothers, to kill them, collect the bounty, which they do. So, they've now killed the brothers, got the bounty, but there's a heart-to-heart between Django and Christoph Waltz, in which they discuss what happened to Django's wife, who was on the same plantation that he was. And unfortunately, the masters discovered this and had them both sold off, intentionally, to different owners, to make sure they're broken apart. So, what sort of turns up now is a revenge drama of Django trying to find who has now got his wife and free her so they can both live together in their freedom. And Christoph Waltz says, well, look, there's no way you, as a black ex-slave, are going to be able to find her. What you need to do is you need my help. And if you spend the winter with me, we can go bounty hunting, we can make some money, and then we can go and find your wife. Which they do, spend the winter together, and eventually they find that Django's wife has been sold off, and she's being held on a plantation owned by Calvin Candy, the a evil Mississippian plantation owner, played with surprising menace actually by Leonardo DiCaprio, who, I mean, DiCaprio of late is undergoing a bit of a renaissance in terms of his films, because I mean, he was in his youth playing a sort of soppy, girl's own, floppy fringe kind of guy, and he's recently come back with things like Shutter Island, things like Inception, and now this, in which he's playing much grittier character, much real character, and the boy can act, which is surprising, because obviously everyone thought from the start he was just pretty boy, but he's not. He can really act, and he's very, very good in this. He's sort of the aloof plantation owner, and what he has in his plantation, he has a retainer played by Samuel L. Jackson called Stephen. Now, DiCaprio, Waltz, and Fox all put in superb performances, but they are nothing compared to the performance you get here from Samuel L. Jackson. And that is the one thing almost every single review is agreeing on, that Samuel L. Jackson's performance here is out of this world. He is really, really good, because what he sort of plays is the opposite of Christoph Waltz. Christoph Waltz is a white character who supports the black characters. What Samuel Jackson is playing, he's playing an older slave, but he's now been so institutionalised and has such love for his masters that he is turning against the slaves. And the tirade he performs when Jamie Foxx first turns up at Plantation as a guest of Calvin Candie, it's brutal and it's very, very offensive, but it's so well played because you see this is a man who can't understand why is there somebody here who's black being treated with the same reverence as you would treat a white guest. It's almost like he doesn't see his own colour, his own people. He basically wants the black slaves treated as badly as they are being treated, if not worse. So his performance is superb. So, you've now got Jamie Foxx and Christoph Waltz have now arrived at the plantation where his wife's being held. They discover his wife, but unfortunately, Stephen discovers their plot. Now, I won't say much what happens after the plot is discovered because I don't want to ruin the ending. What I will say is that there is a firefight, after which Django is captured, and they're going to perform rather nasty things to him. And it's decided instead that he will be sent away. I won't say whether sent away for more torture or for what, but he's sent away in the company of this group of cowboys. Now, this is where the film suddenly hits a really, really rocky patch, because one of these cowboys is played by Quentin Tarantino himself. Now, Quentin, I'm enjoying the film. You're clearly a director who has some substance to him, but my God, he cannot act. He is just, it's so jarring to suddenly have the performances of Jamie Foxx, Christoph Waltz, Samuel L. Jackson, Leonardo DiCaprio, all putting in incredible performances, and suddenly, out of nowhere, you've got to put up with Quentin Tarantino putting on a really, really weird Australian accent for reasons completely unknown. Why is he doing it? He's terrible. And this is where the film really starts to sag, because that section there in which Tarantino is involved, it's unnecessary. There's no reason to have it in there. It doesn't add anything to the story. It doesn't add any kind of sense of pathos or danger. It's totally unnecessary. It shouldn't be there. And it just feels like suddenly you're back in the bad old days of Tarantino. And you're asking yourself, well, why hasn't he got an editor? Why is someone not reading in going, whoa, sorry about that, but that section just isn't necessary. Let's not put it in. Let's just slice that out and carry on for the next bit. Because Django's return is almost identical to when he left. I don't see why we've got that section in between. Other than to have a sort of, I don't know. It seems a bit strange to me. Now, having said that, the film in itself, the problems with it are, as I say, the film is too long. It's almost 3 hours long. And there are sections in there that didn't need to be there. But having said that, there are 4 very, very strong leading performances in there. There are 4 performances of superb acting from 4 people who are brilliant. They really are. Every one of them are excellent. Christoph Waltz, like I say, he steals the show. I would have really liked to have seen in the Best Supporting Actor category both Waltz and Samuel Jackson in there together, because those two really are the best part of the film. In terms of, is it worth going to see? I'd say yeah, I think it is. If you're asking me, has Tarantino reinvented the spaghetti western? No, he certainly hasn't done that. I mean, he's no Sergio Leone. He's just not. I mean, you can tell that's sort of the way he's trying to go with it. He's trying to recreate a Sergio Leone film with comedy. It's sort of like Sergio Leone meets Mel Brooks. The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly meets Blazing Saddles. It's that kind of thing. There's one scene in which they have sort of a sub Ku Klux Klan meeting, in which they all complain about the bags being created for them with the eye holes too far apart. And you sort of think, well, yeah, but we did that joke in Blazing Saddles a long time ago. Why are we having it again now when it's done not quite as well? So that jars a bit. What really does help is that Tarantino has got Ennio Morricone on board doing music, and the opening titles, you're suddenly back to what you know Morricone does so well, which is these rising strings and brass sections, whatever else. It's beautiful music. It really is. I mean, you couldn't really watch a spaghetti western without thinking of Ennio Morricone. So if they're going to recreate one, I think it was vital that Tarantino got him on board. I just think overall, it's a film that's worth going to see purely on the basis of the acting performances. And the look of the thing is really good. You wish that someone was able to rein in Tarantino. You wish that you had some kind of editor on board who would actually say to him, no, we're not doing that bit because it's not necessary. Because you can cut a good half-hour film time by just taking out bits of storyline that aren't necessary. I mean, there's a whole subplot right at the start where Christoph Waltz and Django are in a bar in this small town. And it's an entertaining diversion, but what does it add to the story? In the same way the story of itself, you don't really understand why is Christoph Waltz doing what he's doing. You understand why he's freed Django, because he needs Django to get the money from the bounty on the Three Brothers. You get that, but why is he continuing to help Django? It's not really explained what's in this for Christoph Waltz as a character, and certainly he's never really portrayed as an altruist. He's not there doing things for the sake of it, to help other people. So, the plot has gaping holes in it, and it sags a lot. Tarantino's acting, as we said, is appalling. But ultimately, you never find yourself feeling not entertained. You may find yourself being offended by the violence or the language. If so, just don't go see the film, because that's what you're going to get. And I don't think there's been anything that hasn't pre-warned you that's what you're going to get. So go and see the film. I mean, it's really, really good. It's not going to win the Oscar. Like I said, that's going to get to Les Mis. It can't win the Oscar, but it's a great film. It's really worth seeing. Okay, it's too long, and there are some plot holes and baggy bits, but, you know, what you're going to see is 4 actors at the absolute top of their game, performing superbly. It's worth a go. It's worth a look. Go on. Check it out. I'll see you soon.